Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. The day everything shifted began innocently enough. It was a typical Tuesday evening, the kind of night that usually blended into the others, barely noticeable in the rhythm of our routines. Dinner was done, the kids were upstairs working on their homework, and my wife, Claire, sat across from me on the couch, her gaze fixed on her phone. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for an unmistakable distance in her eyes, as though her attention was somewhere far from our living room. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe she was just wrapped up in work or scrolling through social media, escaping the day-to-day in her usual way. But as the minutes ticked by, I noticed she was more guarded with her phone than usual. Every time I moved a little closer, she'd shift it away, positioning the screen out of my line of sight. I tried to shake it off, focus on the game highlights flashing on the TV, but something felt off. It was a gut feeling, a strange unease that gnawed at the back of my mind. Later that night, as she brushed her teeth and got ready for bed, she left her phone on the nightstand for a brief moment. A voice in my head told me to ignore it, to let it go. But then that gut feeling kicked in harder. Something was wrong, and I couldn't shake the urge to confirm what my intuition was screaming. I picked up her phone. My heart pounded as I glanced at the notifications, my fingers trembling slightly as I scrolled through her recent messages. Most of it was routine, work emails, messages from friends, until a notification appeared from an unsaved number. My hand stilled as I read the preview, "Can't wait to see you this weekend, love." It was like being punched in the gut. My mind reeled, caught between disbelief and anger, a rage simmering beneath the surface. Every word of that message etched itself into my mind, refusing to let go. The world seemed to tilt, and the ground beneath my feet felt less steady. Everything I knew about my wife, about our life, about us, came under scrutiny. Claire emerged from the bathroom, her face washed clean and her hair pulled back. She looked surprised to see me standing there with her phone in hand, her expression immediately shifting into something cautious, guarded. I could tell she sensed something was wrong. "What are you doing with my phone?" she asked, her voice calm but sharp. It was an act, a veil over what she knew I must have seen. "Who's texting you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though anger churned within me. I didn't trust myself to say more without letting it spill over. She hesitated, just for a second. Her mouth opened as if to answer, but she paused, her eyes searching mine. "It's just a colleague," she said quickly, a little too quickly. "We're working on a project, that's all." But she was already fidgeting, her eyes darting to the side, unable to hold my gaze. "A colleague who calls you love and can't wait to see you this weekend?" I shot back, my voice thick with bitterness. I didn't want to shout or accuse, but the words came out that way, tinged with the sting of betrayal. She flinched, taking a half step back, and I could see the mask slip. Her face shifted, the color draining slightly as she realized the extent of what I'd seen. For a moment, she looked like a stranger, someone I'd never known, someone who could hide something so deep, so personal, right under my nose. The room felt colder, as if an invisible line had been drawn between us, dividing us into two worlds. "Please, it's not what you think," she said, her voice small, her hand reaching out to touch my arm. But I stepped back, not wanting her touch, not wanting her reassurance. How many times had she done this, I wondered. How many lies had I swallowed, too distracted by work or our routine to notice? "If it's not what I think, then explain it to me," I said, crossing my arms, my gaze unwavering. "I deserve to know the truth, Claire. Right now." She looked at me, tears beginning to well in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. I was too far gone, too hurt to be swayed by her tears. Slowly, she started talking, piecing together some story about how she'd felt alone, how work had stressed her out, how she had felt like we'd grown distant over the years. She threw in phrases I'd heard countless times from other people's stories of infidelity, the loneliness, the drifting apart, the sense of being unappreciated. It was like she was reciting lines from a script, a well-practiced performance she'd rehearsed before stepping on this stage. I barely registered half of what she was saying. My mind kept wandering back to that message, those words that felt like a knife in my back. I didn't want to listen to her excuses, I didn't want to know why she'd done it. I wanted to know how long. How long she'd been lying to me, betraying the trust I'd given so freely. Is he worth it? I asked quietly, the question hanging heavily in the silence that stretched between us. Is this affair worth everything we built together? She looked at me, stunned, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of shame, perhaps even regret. But I wasn't interested in regrets. Not now. I was already making plans in my head, setting my mind to the things I would need to do. The practicalities of ending this marriage began to solidify, pushing aside the emotion, the hurt, and the memories. Our home, our kids, everything would need to be arranged, reorganized. I was already imagining my life without her, already erasing her from the spaces we'd shared. She opened her mouth to say something, maybe an apology or another excuse, but I held up my hand. I think I've heard enough. I don't need your explanations. I just need you to know that I'll never forget this. For the first time, her composure cracked completely, and she let out a sob. But it didn't soften me. If anything, it confirmed what I'd already decided. There would be no second chances here. No trust to rebuild, no promises to keep. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be solved with apologies or tears. That night, I slept in the guest room, letting the silence of the empty space wash over me, sealing my decision with the quiet resolve that had settled deep within me. The image of that message, of the words, love, and weekend, replayed in my mind, reminding me of what I could never forget, a truth that had shattered the world I thought I knew. In the morning, I started making arrangements. I needed time, space, and a plan to unravel the life we'd built together. And for the first time, I felt a strange calmness, a cold clarity that replaced the anger and hurt from the night before. She had made her choice, now I was making mine. The days that followed were surreal, like I was living someone else's life. Claire and I barely spoke, each going through the motions of our daily routines as if nothing had happened. She'd try to engage me in small talk, her tone forced and brittle, but I would brush her off with brief, hollow responses. Our kids noticed the tension, of course. I could see it in the worried looks they exchanged, the way they avoided our gaze. But what could I tell them? How could I explain that the foundation of our family had cracked in a way that couldn't be fixed? I busied myself with the practical steps of preparing for the end. I called a lawyer, discreetly, setting up a consultation for later in the week. I had no idea what kind of split I wanted, or how we would handle custody. I didn't even know if I wanted to stay in the house we'd built together. Part of me wanted to leave it behind, to start fresh without the memories that now felt tainted, every room a reminder of her betrayal. The other part of me wanted to fight for it, to make sure she was the one who had to pack up and go. Claire, on the other hand, seemed caught in a state of denial. She'd try to make dinner like everything was normal, setting the table with care, serving the kids their plates. She'd ask about my day, her voice trembling with forced cheer. I almost pitied her attempts to hold on to the image of the life we'd shared. But every time I looked at her, that pity twisted into something sharper, something bitter. She was no longer the woman I thought I'd known, and the life she was trying to preserve felt like a lie. By Thursday, I'd had enough of the pretense. I walked into the kitchen where she was cleaning up after dinner, the kids already upstairs for the night. She looked up, hopeful, as if she'd been waiting for me to make the first move, to tell her that I was ready to forgive her, to move past it. But I had no intention of giving her that relief. We need to talk about how this is going to work, I said, my tone flat, letting her know this wasn't a conversation about reconciliation. She froze, the hope in her eyes dimming as reality set in. Work? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Yes. We both know this isn't going to get better, I replied. I've called a lawyer. I'm filing for divorce. Her face fell, and for a moment, she looked devastated. But I wasn't moved. This isn't something we can fix with counseling or promises. You made a choice, Claire, and now we're both dealing with the consequences. She tried to speak, but I cut her off, unwilling to hear whatever excuse or plea she had prepared. I need you to understand that I'm doing this for me. For our kids. They deserve better than to grow up in a house where their parents pretend to love each other. The words hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back, bracing herself against the kitchen counter, her face pale. I was wrong. I made a mistake, but I love you. I love our family. You should have thought of that before, I replied coldly, my voice a knife's edge. This isn't about love, Claire. This is about trust. You destroyed it, and I don't see how you can ever earn it back. Her hands shook as she reached for a glass, filling it with water in a futile attempt to steady herself. She looked at me, desperate, her eyes searching for a trace of the man who might have softened, who might have offered forgiveness. But that man was gone, buried under layers of hurt and betrayal. I was lonely, she said finally, her voice small, her gaze fixed on the floor. I felt like we were drifting apart, like you were always so focused on work or the kids. I felt invisible. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. So, you thought the answer was to find someone else? To betray me and tear apart our family? She flinched at my words, her shoulders slumping in defeat. It wasn't like that, she whispered. I never meant for it to happen. It just did. That's not an excuse, I said, shaking my head. Do you realize what you've done? Not just to me, but to our kids, to everything we built. She didn't answer, but the guilt in her eyes was answer enough. For the first time, I saw genuine regret there, a glimpse of the Claire I'd thought I'd married. But it was too late. The damage was done, and no amount of regret could change that. After a few minutes of tense silence, I spoke again, my voice softer but no less resolute. I'm moving forward with this, Claire. I'll be meeting with my lawyer tomorrow. I think it's best if we start making arrangements, for the house, for the kids. She nodded, swallowing hard as she tried to hold back tears. What about the kids? How are we going to tell them? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. The kids. They'd be the ones most affected by this, the ones whose world would be turned upside down. I had no idea how to explain to them that their mother and I would no longer be together, that our family would no longer be whole. But I knew it had to be done. We'll tell them together, I said finally. This weekend. They deserve the truth, as much as they can understand it. Claire's face crumpled, and for a brief moment, I almost felt sympathy. Almost. But the memory of that message, the words that had shattered everything, kept me steady. This was the path we were on, and there was no turning back. The rest of the night passed in silence, each of us retreating to separate corners of the house, lost in our own thoughts. I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on me. I tried to imagine a life without her, a new beginning. It wasn't the future I'd once dreamed of, but it was the only one left. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, a practical, no-nonsense woman who laid out the steps with clinical efficiency. I barely registered half of what she said, my mind still fogged with the reality of what I was setting in motion. But when she asked about custody, I knew exactly what I wanted. I want primary custody, I told her firmly. I don't want my kids shuffled between homes every other weekend. They need stability. She nodded, jotting down notes as she explained the process, the paperwork, the court appearances. It all felt distant, surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. But this was my life now. And the sooner I accepted it, the sooner I could begin to rebuild. By the time I got home that afternoon, Claire was sitting in the living room, a defeated look on her face. I could tell she'd been crying, her eyes red and puffy, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, a glimmer of hope in her eyes that quickly faded when she saw the expression on my face. "I met with the lawyer," I said, my tone emotionless. "We'll need to start dividing assets, figuring out living arrangements." She nodded, her shoulders slumping as the finality of it all sank in. I don't want to lose the kids," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but they're my life." "Then you'll need to prove it," I replied, my voice hard. "You're going to have to earn back their trust, just like you would have had to earn mine. But it won't be easy." She looked away, her face etched with pain, and I could see the weight of her guilt pressing down on her. But I didn't soften. This was the path she had chosen, and now she would have to walk it, just as I would. We spent the next few days in a tense truce, both of us bracing ourselves for the conversation with the kids. When the weekend finally arrived, we sat down with them in the living room, their innocent faces filled with confusion as they sensed the gravity of the moment. Claire started to speak, her voice choked with emotion, but I took over, keeping my tone steady as I explained to them what was happening. I told them that we loved them, that this wasn't their fault, that we would always be there for them. But as I spoke, I felt the weight of our words settling over them, the reality of our broken family sinking in. When it was over, they clung to me, their faces streaked with tears, and for the first time since this all began, I felt the true cost of what Claire had done. It wasn't just my heart that had been shattered, it was theirs as well. And that was something she could never undo. The days after we told the kids were the hardest I'd ever experienced. Their questions lingered, quiet and confused, like they were afraid of the answers. I spent most of my time with them, taking them out to the park, helping with homework, trying to reassure them as much as I could. But how do you reassure children who've just been told that the life they've always known is breaking apart? My son, Dylan, had taken it the hardest. He was 12, old enough to understand more than his sister, Emma, but still too young to fully process what was happening. He'd been quiet since we told him, and Emma, retreating into himself, spending hours in his room with the door shut. I could hear his music playing through the walls, loud and insistent, as if he were using it to drown out the reality of our situation. I'd knock on his door, try to talk to him, but he'd always brush me off with a "fine, Dad," or a "just leave me alone." It broke my heart to see him like this, to know that he was carrying a weight he didn't deserve. Emma, only 8, seemed more confused than sad. She'd come up to me at random times during the day, tugging on my shirt, her little face serious, asking questions I struggled to answer. "Daddy, are you still going to live with us? Are you and Mommy mad at each other? Will we still have family movie night?" Each question was a dagger, each one reminding me of what she'd lost. I tried to be honest, to tell her that things would be different but that I would always be there, that I wasn't leaving her. But I could see the hurt in her eyes, the way she clung to me a little longer each night when I tucked her in. And no matter what I said, I knew she could feel the strain, the tension between her mother and me. Claire had retreated into herself, barely speaking unless it was about the logistics of our split. She'd take her meals in silence, avoid eye contact, and try to stay out of my way. I could see the guilt weighing on her, but it brought me no comfort. If anything, her quiet presence in the house only fueled the resentment I felt, a resentment that grew every time I looked at our children's faces, every time I saw the sadness that had settled over our home. One evening, about a week after we broke the news to the kids, I came home late after a meeting with my lawyer. The house was dark, the kids already in bed, and as I passed by the kitchen, I noticed Claire sitting at the table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and swollen, her face pale. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, part of me wanting to ignore her, to walk upstairs and leave her in the silence she'd chosen. But something in her voice held me there. I nodded, pulling out a chair across from her, keeping a careful distance. She looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap, gathering her thoughts. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't ever undo. And I know I'm the one to blame for all of this. But I just wanted to say I'm sorry, really sorry. Not for the things I told myself or my reasons, not for any excuses. Just, sorry. I didn't respond. The word, sorry, felt hollow to me, like a whisper lost in the wind. What good was sorry now, after she'd torn our family apart? She took a shaky breath, her gaze fixed on the table. I know you don't believe me, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I can't keep pretending like it was just some mistake. It was selfish, and I betrayed everything we built. I let myself get caught up in something that felt exciting, and I didn't think about what it would cost. I clenched my jaw, anger flickering beneath the surface. And was it worth it, Claire? Was that excitement worth destroying our family? Hurting our kids? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might start to cry again. No, she whispered. It wasn't worth it. Nothing about it was worth losing you, losing our life together. And I can't believe I let it go that far. I leaned back, crossing my arms over my chest. Then why did you do it? Was I not enough? Were the kids not enough? She shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. It wasn't about you, or the kids, or anything you did. It was something broken in me. I don't even fully understand it, but I know I can't go back and change it. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Part of me wanted to unleash the hurt, the rage I'd been carrying, to throw it all at her feet and watch her suffer under its weight. But I was too tired for that, too weary of the endless cycle of anger and resentment. Well, congratulations, Claire. You've finally figured out that some things can't be fixed. I hope it was worth it. Her shoulders sagged, and she wiped a tear from her cheek. She nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less. I deserve that. I deserve everything coming my way. You're right about that, I replied coldly. You deserve to carry this guilt, to remember what you've done to this family. Because I won't be here to remind you. A silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. Regret, maybe, or the painful understanding that she'd shattered something beyond repair. What about the kids? She asked quietly. How are we going to make this work? They need us. Both of us. I sighed, running a hand over my face. I don't know, Claire. All I know is that I'm not going to let them suffer because of this. I'll do whatever it takes to give them some kind of stability, even if it means we have to find a way to co-parent. But make no mistake, I won't be pretending we're a family anymore. Not for them, not for anyone. She nodded, her gaze dropping to the table again. I understand, she murmured. I'll do whatever you think is best. I just want them to be okay. I felt a surge of anger at her words, the hypocrisy of it all. She'd torn apart their world, and now she wanted to play the role of a concerned mother. But I bit back my retort, swallowing it down, focusing on the only thing that mattered, the kids. After a few more minutes of strained silence, I pushed back my chair, standing up. We'll figure it out, I said, my tone clipped. But not tonight. She nodded, not looking up as I left the room. I walked upstairs, feeling an odd numbness settle over me. The anger had burned out, leaving only an emptiness in its place, a hollow ache that stretched through every corner of our once warm home. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts drifted to the future. I tried to imagine what life would look like after the divorce, tried to picture myself without her, without the constant weight of betrayal pressing down on me. Part of me felt a strange kind of relief, as if I could finally breathe freely, unshackled from the lies and deception that had woven themselves into our lives. But another part of me mourned what we'd lost, the dreams and memories we'd built together. In the darkness, I resolved to focus on the one thing I could still protect, my children. They didn't deserve to pay the price for their mother's choices, and I would do everything in my power to give them a sense of stability, to rebuild their trust in the people who loved them. Even if that meant putting aside my anger, swallowing my pride, and finding a way to coexist with Claire as nothing more than co-parents. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling a grim determination settle over me. This wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was the one I had now. And I would do whatever it took to make sure my kids had a chance at happiness, even if it meant leaving behind the love I'd once thought was unbreakable. That day, I started the paperwork for custody, spoke to my lawyer about visitation schedules, and began mapping out the details of a life divided. The process was long, grueling, and at times gut-wrenching, but with each step, I felt a little more of the weight lift. The pain didn't disappear, but I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could build something new, something that wasn't defined by betrayal. And as I looked at my kids that night, their faces calm as they drifted off to sleep, I knew that, for them, I would endure anything. They were my reason now, the anchor that kept me steady in the midst of the storm. And as I walked back to my room, I resolved to give them the life they deserved, a life built on truth, on trust, on a love that would never waver. In the months that followed, life began to settle into a rhythm again. I was learning how to manage as a single dad, figuring out routines with Dylan and Emma, making sure they felt as grounded as possible. The house, though still filled with memories, no longer felt oppressive. I'd painted the walls, rearranged furniture, changed small things to make the space mine. To make it feel like a new beginning. Claire had moved to an apartment across town, and we'd come to an arrangement. The kids would stay with me, and she'd visit them during the week, taking them every other weekend. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. The anger that had once consumed me was finally beginning to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. I could see that Dylan was coming around, starting to open up again, and Emma's questions had softened, her bright smile returning bit by bit. The wounds were healing, slowly but surely. One Saturday morning, I decided to take the kids out to breakfast at a small diner near the lake. It was a rare sunny day, and I thought the fresh air would do us good. As we sat by the window, watching the lake sparkle in the distance, Emma looked up at me, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Daddy, do you still love Mommy?" she asked, her voice innocent and clear. Dylan looked up too, a hint of interest flickering in his expression. I took a breath, surprised by the question, and thought carefully before answering. "I'll always care about your mom," I said gently. "But love changes. Sometimes it's not the same as it was before." Emma seemed to accept this, nodding thoughtfully. She went back to her pancakes, and the conversation drifted to lighter things. But something about her question lingered with me. The way she'd looked at me, as if searching for some deeper truth, stirred something I hadn't felt in a while. I'd spent so long trying to move past my anger, trying to build a new life, that I hadn't considered whether I'd actually let go of everything that had happened. As we left the diner, I noticed Claire's car parked outside. She must have seen us too, because she stepped out, hesitating before waving at us. The kids ran up to her, excited to see her unexpectedly, and I walked up, exchanging a polite nod. Our conversations had been sparse, just enough to coordinate schedules and logistics. But that day, something felt different. "Mind if I walk with you?" she asked quietly as the kids ran ahead to the lake. I shrugged, unsure but willing to go along. We walked in silence for a while, watching Dylan skip rocks across the water while Emma chased a flock of ducks along the shore. Claire cleared her throat, glancing at me. "I've been wanting to talk to you," she began, her voice soft. "There are things I haven't told you. Things I should have told you." I frowned, uncertain where she was going with this. "What is it, Claire? Haven't we said enough already?" She hesitated, her gaze fixed on the water. "I know it doesn't matter now. We're not the same people we were, and I understand if you don't want to hear it. But there's a reason why I did what I did. And I don't mean the excuses I told you before. I sighed, looking away. I wasn't sure I wanted to dredge up old wounds, especially when we'd finally reached a place of civility. But something in her expression, a strange mix of vulnerability and determination, made me pause. Go on, I said finally. She took a deep breath. A year before all of this happened, I was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. Cancer. Why didn't you tell me? I didn't want to worry you, she said quietly, tears pooling in her eyes. At first, I thought I could handle it on my own. The doctors said they'd caught it early, and with treatment, there was a good chance I'd make a full recovery. But as time went on, the weight of it, the fear, the uncertainty, it got to me. I felt isolated, lost, like I was drifting away from everyone, even you. I shook my head, disbelief and anger bubbling up. So your solution was to have an affair? To destroy our family? She closed her eyes, pain flickering across her face. I know it doesn't make sense. But I was terrified, William. Terrified of dying, of leaving you and the kids. And instead of facing that fear, I ran from it. I sought comfort in something, someone who didn't remind me of everything I was afraid to lose. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. I didn't know how to respond. I felt betrayed all over again, but this time, the betrayal was tangled with a deep sadness, an understanding of the pain she must have felt. The idea that she'd faced something so terrifying alone, it gnawed at me. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered, my voice thick. I would have been there for you. We could have faced it together. I know, she replied, wiping a tear from her cheek. And I'll never forgive myself for shutting you out. But I thought that if I pretended everything was normal, that if I kept it hidden, maybe I wouldn't have to face it myself. It was cowardly and selfish, and I know it cost me everything. We stood in silence, the sound of the kids' laughter echoing across the water. Part of me wanted to scream, to let out the anger and grief that had been building since she'd first shattered our lives. But another part of me felt a strange, unexpected empathy. I could see her pain, her regret, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of understanding. Are you okay now? I asked, my voice barely audible. She nodded, a sad smile on her lips. Yes. I finished my treatments a few months ago. The doctors say I'm in remission. I should have told you sooner. But I didn't want to use it as an excuse. I didn't want you to think I was asking for pity. I looked away, swallowing the lump in my throat. This changes things, Claire. It doesn't fix what happened. But, it changes things. She nodded, her eyes full of unshed tears. I don't expect forgiveness. I know that what we had is gone, and I'll live with that. But I just wanted you to know. I wanted to be honest, even if it's too late. As I watched her walk back to the car, I felt a strange weight lift. It was as if the anger, the bitterness that had clung to me for so long, was finally beginning to dissolve. There was still pain, still regret, but there was also an understanding, a glimmer of compassion that I hadn't thought I was capable of feeling again. Over the weeks that followed, Claire and I spoke more openly, carefully navigating the new boundaries of our relationship. We weren't together, and we never would be, but there was a peace between us now, a sense of closure that allowed us to truly co-parent. And, in some small way, I began to heal. Months later, I found myself standing in front of the lake again, watching the kids skip stones across the water. Claire had just dropped them off, and as she waved goodbye, I felt something I hadn't expected, a quiet gratitude. For the first time, I didn't see her as my betrayer. I saw her as a flawed, fragile human, someone who had faced a fear beyond my understanding and who had paid the price for her mistakes. As I turned back to the lake, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face, I realized that I was finally free. Free from the anger, the resentment, the bitterness. Free to start anew, to embrace a future that was mine alone. And in that moment, I knew that I was ready to begin living again, with a heart that had been broken but had somehow found its way back to wholeness.